Good morning, class. Welcome to another chapter of our Read Aloud. So we're on chapter 12 today, and last time we got to know John Thornton, right? And he and Buck have formed a really beautiful bond. They love each other, and it's very cool to see. And Buck has regained his strength, and he's also really hearing the call of the wild, which is kind of cool. We'll see where that takes us. And we've met John Thornton's partners now, okay? So now let's see what happens next. So this is chapter 12, The Sled Pull. Okay. In Dawson that winter, Buck showed this uncanny loyalty and love for John Thornton. The three partners had stopped off at a saloon one evening. Black Burton was there, an evil-tempered bully, and he was picking a fight with a young tenderfoot. Trying to hold tempers down, Thornton stepped in between. Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner of the room, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Black Burton struck out without warning and hit Thornton. He was sent spinning, and he saved himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard something, not a bark or a yelp, but something like a roar. They saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left the floor for Burton's throat. The man saved his life by blocking with his arm, but was hurtled backward with Buck on top of him. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off. While a doctor attended to Burton, Buck prowled up and down, growling, trying to rush in. Only heavy clubs could drive him back. A meeting was called on the spot, and all agreed that the dog had a just cause for attacking Burton. He was allowed to leave with Thornton, but his reputation was made. From that day, his name spread through every camp in Alaska. Buck, because of his fame, was often compared to other dogs, and Thornton was driven to defend him. When the subject of dogs came up at the El Dorado saloon one night, several men boasted of their favorites. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second man bragged 600 for his dog. A third man, a man named Mathewson, boasted that his dog could start 700. "Ha!" said John Thornton. "Buck can start 1,000 pounds. That's a lot. "And break it out of the snow and walk off with it for 100 yards, demanded Mathewson. "And break it out and walk it off for 100 yards, replied John Thornton. "Well," said Mathewson slowly so that all could hear, "I've got $1,000 that says he can't, and there it is." He slammed a sack of gold dust upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face, like blushing. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds, half a ton. He had great faith in Buck's strength, but how could he put Buck up to such a task? Plus, he didn't have $1,000, and nor did Hans or Pete. The eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. "I've got a sled standing outside right now with 20 50-pound sacks of flour on it," Mathewson went on. "We can put your dog to the test any time." Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face, trying to gather his thoughts. The face of Jim O'Brien, an old friend, caught Thornton's eye. "Can you lend me 1,000? he asked Jim, almost in a whisper. "Sure," answered O'Brien, thumping down a sack next to Mathewson. "But I don't think, John, that the dog can do the trick." The saloon emptied into the street. Several hundred men gathered to watch and bet on the outcome. Mathewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours, and the sled runners had frozen fast to the hard-packed snow. Not a man believed the dog could even budge the sled, and they all bet against Buck. Thornton looked at the sled itself with the regular team of 10 dogs still in harness. He had hurried into this foolishly, and the task looked impossible. Mathewson, on the other hand, was quite pleased. 3-to-1 odds, he proclaimed. "I'll bet you another $1,000, Thornton. What do you say?" Thornton's doubt was strong, but so were his pride and fighting spirit. The fighting spirit that does not care about the odds, that does not believe that something is impossible. Thornton went back to the saloon and called Hans and Pete to him. Together they came up with $200. This was all they had, yet they laid it on the table. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck was harnessed to the sled. He felt the excitement in the air, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. The men took note of this splendid animal. He was in perfect condition, with 150 pounds of pure muscle and grit. His furry coat shone, and every hair seemed to be alive. Men felt his muscles, proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down 2-to-1. "Gad, sir! Gad, sir!" stuttered one bearded man. "I offer you $800 for him, sir, before the test. 800, just as he stands." Thornton shook his head and stepped over to Buck's side. "You must stand off from him," Mathewson protested. So, get away from him. The crowd fell silent. Everybody saw that Buck was indeed a magnificent animal, but 1,000 pounds! How could he break out and pull such a load? Thornton knelt down by Buck's side. He took his head in his hands and rested cheek on cheek. He did not playfully shake him as he usually did or tease him with words. Instead, he just whispered in his ear, "As you love me, Buck, as you love me." Buck whined with an eagerness to please. The crowd was watching curiously. This was odd, a man whispering to a dog. As Thornton got to his feet, Buck seized his mittened hand between his paws, pressing in with his teeth and then letting go. That was the answer, not of speech, but of love. Thornton stepped well back. "Now, Buck," he said. Buck tightened the traces, then let them loosen a bit. It was the way he had learned. "Gee!" Thornton's voice rang out sharply. Buck swung to the right with all his might. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp crackling. So he's breaking out the runners. "Ha!" Thornton commanded. Buck pulled this time to the left. The crackling turned into a snapping. The runners slipped several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Every man was holding his breath. "Now mush!" Thornton's command cracked out like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward. His whole body and every muscle went into the effort. His great chest was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad, the claws digging into the hard-packed snow. The sled swayed slightly. One of Buck's feet slipped and one man groaned aloud. The sled jerked ahead half an inch, 2 inches. The jerks became fewer until the sled was moving ahead slowly, steadily. Men gasped and began to breathe again. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, cheery words. As he neared the pile of firewood that marked the end of the 100 yards, a cheer began to grow and grow, which burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man began to jump with joy and wonder, even Mathewson. Hats and mittens were flying in the air. Men were shaking hands and bubbling over in general excitement. But Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. Head against head, he was shaking him back and forth. Those close by heard him roughing it up and growling words at Buck, softly and lovingly. "You old rascal, you darned old rascal." "I'll give you $1,000 for him, sir, $1,000, sir," exclaimed the bearded man. Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. The tears were streaming down his cheeks. "Sir," he said, "no, sir. You can forget it, sir." Buck seized Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth. Man and dog romped alone within their special love for each other, while all the men looked on in wonder. And that is today's chapter.